James was Jesus' his little brother, and what's unique about James was that he was not a believer. He didn't believe in Jesus, that he was God, up until after Jesus was murdered on the cross. 3 days later, he rose again. James saw him face to face, and he's like, oh, that stuff that you were talking about was actually true. And so James becomes a follower of Jesus after the fact. Up until that point, thinks he's crazy, and then he becomes a follower of Jesus, which I don't know what it takes to get your brother to call you God, but probably a lot. Like a lot. And so really, really big deal, becomes a pastor, and he's writing this letter to some new Christians. A lot of them were Jewish who have become Christians. And so it's been a really encouraging conversation and book, but now James is kind of getting frustrated. And so one of the big themes that he has been addressing was this religious language that talks a lot but does very little. So we've seen a lot of this conversation of trying to encourage people to say, hey, if our faith doesn't move into our hands, and it doesn't move into our words, and it doesn't move into our actions, if there's not something demonstrating what we say we believe, then James would call it a dead faith. He says it's useless. What's the point of playing church and having religious language and having a head knowledge of God without it actually mattering and making a difference in our lives and the world around us? And so we've been kind of in this vein, and now we're in chapter 3 today. But before we pick it up, I want to give us a metaphor. I don't normally do this. We've been just kind of walking through it, but today's conversation is around wisdom. Now, I don't know, think right now, who's the wisest person that you can think of? Gandalf. That is hilarious. I wish I would have thought of that. Good job. So, right. When you think about it, wisdom is one of these unique conversations, and I don't know that you walked in today hungry for wisdom. You're like, you know what? I've been thinking about it all week, and I really need some wisdom. I don't normally find that on my top list. Now, ironically, I need it often, but it's not something I felt like I walked in needing. So what I want to do is create a hunger for us of why this conversation matters, because if we don't care about it, then we might as well go home. So let me help us care about it. So let me give you a metaphor. Over and over again in the Bible, we see Jesus and others compare our spiritual lives in this life to agriculture. And so fruit and trees and vines and lots of farming language, one, because there was a lot of agriculture happening at the time, but also just because it makes a lot of sense. It's really easy to look at a tree and say, hey, there's a tree and a branch and an apple, and put the pieces together. And so today I want to build a picture of our lives. So just individually and collectively in this room, in Boulder, in our country, think of life as a garden. Anybody garden in here? A couple of us, cool. Not I. I kill everything I touch, and so I mooch off of other people's gardening, which is awesome. Turns out I have green onions in my flower bed, and I didn't even know it. So I'm going to cook those bad boys up. You don't really cook them, but I'm going to eat them, that's for sure. So I want you to think about our hearts and our souls as the collective soil of this garden called life. Are you with me? Okay? And so the conversation we're moving into today is what's being planted in our hearts, in our lives, in our souls, and in the lives of others around us, and should we care? And so when you ask the question, why is wisdom necessary? Why is this conversation important? Because wisdom is knowing what to plant where, when to plant it, what's going to grow where, what's valuable, and if you're let me just back it up for a minute. Think about all of life. Our words and our actions, we're constantly planting seeds, right? So look back in your life. People have planted some really valuable things in your life. The words that they spoke over you, maybe the way that they served you, they planted some really valuable things in your life. Are you with me? Also, you can probably look back and you can see some people who planted some really negative things in your life. You have roots that cause certain dispositions and behaviors and reactions in you that are really negative and really ugly, and we would call them a weed, and they're in there because someone planted it there or an experience planted it there. And so I want you to think about life as a garden. There's all these things being planted in and around our lives. And what would be nice is if we each had our own little planter box, and my garden's my garden and your garden's your garden, and you can plant whatever you want. I'm going to plant whatever, and we're never going to cross-pollinate, and we're not going to touch each other, and it's going to be fine. But the problem is people's gardens are all up in our business, right? And so people's weeds are trying to creep over into ours, and someone's cotton tree is all up in our allergy grill. This is a really good analogy, guys. This is super helpful, okay? So again, why do we need wisdom? Wisdom is knowing what to plant, when to plant it, why to plant it, having all that motivation. And so when life gets hard, listen, we took some time before the service and we prayed over all the victims that have been affected by the shootings that are in Texas and now in Ohio as a result of this morning. And if you haven't, you can just check it out online. It's horrendous. And we look at that, and I read last night, that as of the shooting in Ohio, that's the 250th shooting we've had in America this year. And it's unacceptable, and it's evil, and it's tragic, and our hearts are broken for the families involved, and it's so much more than even that. That's just the last 24 hours. And so when life gets hard and when things are uncertain, and we need wisdom to say, what do I need to plant right now? I would like to propose that we need to plant more than good vibes, right? Are you with me? Right? Someone's having a hard day and they'll post online, they'll shoot an Instagram post or on Facebook like, hey, send good vibes my way because life is hard right now. To be honest, I think we need a little more than good vibes for the people in El Paso and in Ohio and even in our lives. Good vibes aren't really cutting it. And so wisdom is, what do we need to plant? What's the right action to take in light of the evil that we're seeing take place in our country, all around our world? What wisdom do we need to be applying? And that's the conversation that we're having today. And so I hope that this creates a hunger that, hey, if nothing else, we would at least like to have some wisdom when it comes to what needs to be planted. And you know what? I was thinking about, even when life is good, we tend to not think about it as much, but it matters just as much what we're planting when life is good as when it's bad, doesn't it? Right? Because the rule of planting, the rule of a garden, the rule of harvesting is you reap what you sow. Right? What I'm planting right now, I'm going to reap later. What I'm putting into my kids, I'm going to reap later. What I'm putting into my marriage, I'm going to reap later. What I'm putting into my bank account, quite physically, I'm going to reap later, or taking out, depends on what you're doing. And so, right, we need wisdom. Not only what do we plant when, but also what's a weed and what needs to be pulled from our lives, right? There's some things that we get clouded judgment on that are not good for us, that are actually hurting us and the world around us. And so how do we be wise when it comes to navigating this life as a garden? Now, because I have some professional experience here, I'm gonna just help you know why this is so important to me. I was hired a couple of years ago. I owned a lawn company, and someone hired me to do their flower bed. And I never really signed up for that, but I thought, cool, I'll give it a shot. Turns out that's the worst job in the world, okay? Flower beds are awful, and it was one of those that grass had grown up in it, which is even worse. Like, you just set it on fire with gasoline is really all you can do. And so they're like, hey, pull all the grass out, all the weeds out, and get their huge, humongous flower bed clean. So I'm like, cool, I can do that. And I go in, and it's hot, and it's in Texas, and I'm grinding it all day. I'm pulling weeds and pulling grass and getting it clean for them. And I get a phone call the next day after I'm done. They're like, hey, you pulled all of our flowers out. And I was like, oh, are you sure? Like, yeah, you pulled all the flowers out we just planted. And I'm like, no, I pulled all the weeds. They're like, no, you pulled our flowers. And I'm like, well, they look like weeds to me. You need to pick some different flowers, right? Like, and I was like, oh, well, I needed, so in the moment, I'm like, well, that was dumb. And then they didn't pay me, and it was just a bad deal. And so I didn't know. I didn't have the wisdom. I just didn't have the practical wisdom to know that those were flowers. They did not look like flowers, for the record. But I pulled them all. And so I had to go back and replant flowers. It was awful. Same thing in our life when we're looking, like, how do we know what's good and what's bad and what should be pulled and what do we keep? And I don't know, man, like, what kind of weeds do you have in your life? When it comes to wisdom, this applies to our relationships, right? You ever look back at a relationship, you say, that was dumb, right? Probably, right? Or a financial decision that you made, or some advice that you gave. You're like, that was bad advice. Or, I shouldn't have spent that money. Or like that Netflix binge that I did, that was a poor use of time, right? Maybe not in the moment, but like the next day, you're like, wasn't worth it, right? We make decisions all the time. We're planting and we're pulling out, and we're trying to have the wisdom of how do we use this life. Now, what I want to propose to us today is that the best way we can figure out how to navigate this life and take care of this garden called life, not only for ourselves, but also for our community and for our family and for our friends and for our nation and for the world. The bigger purpose of it is, I think we need to take a look at the master gardener. And so if this life is a garden, I want you to think for a minute, gardens don't happen by accident, right? Weeds happen by accident. If you have a planter box and you just hope that it grows everything that you wanted for the year, it's not going to happen, right? It's going to be all kinds of weird stuff and most likely weeds. And so I want you to think, if this life is a garden, this planet is a garden, then God has created it all, designed it all to function and create life in a certain way. And there is a plan, and we can actually look to the master gardener for what it looks like. What should we be planting and what should we be pulling? Now, when it comes to this conversation of wisdom, there's a presumed understanding that James is going to deal with, and we're at a disadvantage. So I don't normally take a backtrack like this like we're going to do, but we're going to have to today because he's operating with an understanding of wisdom that you're not going to find in the English dictionary. And so the simple definition, if you're taking notes to be super helpful, the simple definition that we're using for wisdom is the application of knowledge. Wisdom is simply the application of knowledge. And so let me just break it down really simple, okay? Knowledge is theoretical, whereas wisdom is practical. I can read a book on how to work on a car. Wisdom allows me to apply that book. Does this make sense? Knowledge is truthful. Wisdom turns it into useful information. Knowledge is based on information. Wisdom leads to transformation. Knowledge stays in the belief realm. Wisdom translates that belief into behavior. Does this make sense? And so the very simple definition is wisdom is the application of knowledge. But we have to do some backtracking on the way James is going to use it, because he's operating of an understanding of who God is that maybe we don't have. And so I realize that some of us are not followers of Jesus in the room. Some of you aren't Christians. Some of you come from all kinds of backgrounds. And so, man, our desire is to meet you where you are, help you take some next steps. And so I hope this is going to be super helpful. So the first thing is, let's define wisdom from what we see in the Bible, the wisdom that James is operating with, okay? Proverbs 9:10 says that the fear of the Lord, the fear of God, is the beginning of wisdom, or the foundation of wisdom. And so if we want wisdom to know what to plant, when to plant, how to plant, then it starts right here, is what the book of Proverbs says. And that word fear, just for the record, it's not like scared of God fear. It's not like I'm afraid I might get zapped by lightning, although some people legitimately have that fear. God doesn't operate like this. This word is better translated reverence or respect. It's a proper understanding of who God is and what he's about. And so we'll just take a pop quiz for a moment. When you think of God, when you think, even if you don't believe there is a God, if there was a God, what would he look like, and what is he required to have, and what makes up this idea of God? And so the beginning of wisdom is founded on this big idea. Now, here's the challenge, is as we have this conversation, our Western culture gets stuck on this individualization that we're constantly pressed into. And so because of the way that our culture focuses its attention on promoting ourselves, we are taught to think that we're the point of life. Like we're the center of the universe. Like we have our own little planter box, and that's all that matters, right? Life is a garden, great, but my garden's my garden, and your garden's your garden. Stay out of my garden. Leave me alone. The way I want to plant, the way I want to garden, this is mine right here. We have a very individualized approach to the conversation of wisdom. And so let me just ask you a question. Do you ever want to be the point? Do you ever want to be the center of a conversation happening at work, or in the middle of your friends, or with a significant other, or with your family? Have you ever wanted to be the point in the middle of traffic? Right? You ever? I find myself wanting to be the point often. Like I'll be in the middle of traffic, and this road was made for me, and you're driving poorly, and get out of my way, right? I'm the point. I wouldn't say it out loud that I'm the point, but I am making myself the point. Have you ever made yourself the point at a fast food restaurant? Right? I showed up to get good food, well, maybe subpar food at a quick pace, and if you don't deliver it quickly, then I'm upset about it because I'm the point. The customer's always right. The other day I was mad at Sonic because they were doing a deal, and I showed up, and their deals were awful, and all their apps were down, and they were just not on top of their game, and I'm like, all right, Sonic, I'm going to file a complaint. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? Such an entitled white dude, right? Living in America. I want to show you, Sonic, for not serving me the way you're supposed to, because I'm the point. I don't know about you, right? When I get home, it'd be awesome if the kids were just disappeared and were quiet somewhere, and Danielle's like, hey baby, welcome home. I made you dinner, and I'm ready to give you a back massage, and your favorite movie's gonna be on, right? No, I'm not gonna be upset about that, right? How many of you like to be the point? It's easy for us to be the point even when we don't want to be the point. And here's what happens is when we read the Bible, we tend to operate out of our individualized Western mindset. And so we think that God is really into us. And if you've heard, listen, God is totally into you. God loves you. But we read the Bible in light of me, I. And so let me show you Psalm 23. This is one of the most famous Psalms, read at a lot of funerals. Even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard some of this before. The Lord is what? My shepherd. I don't have to want. He makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside still waters, and he restores my soul. He's like a super butler, right? He leads me in the paths of righteousness. Why? For his name's sake. what we tend to do is we read this and like, God is so good and he's for us and he loves us and he's serving us. And we read stuff like this and it sounds like God is really into us, and we tend to like gloss over this last part. Why did he do it? What's the purpose? Why did God send Jesus to prove his love to the world, to die in our place, to raise again, to save us and bring us back into relationship with God? Because we're awesome? No, right? It's actually my incredible lack of awesomeness that is the point. Right? In this conversation, when God is my shepherd and we're sheep, but that's not a compliment, guys. Right? That's not something to like, woohoo, yeah, right? Sheep are dumb. There's a reason they need shepherds, right? Like, this is not a compliment. I'm so dumb, I need a shepherd. That's what it's saying. You're like, oh, wait a minute, hold on. And so why is God doing this? Because it's our lack of awesomeness. It's our lack of aptitude. It's our inability to be right with God. It's our inability to live in right ways. It's our selfishness that says we're the point that pushes us away from a relationship with God. And he says, man, listen, I love you. I created you. I created this life called a garden, and there's a way that it's supposed to work. I'm going to send Jesus to bring you back into relationship with me, and it shows how awesome God is, not how awesome we are. Does this make sense? God is so awesome that he would expand the universe and be born as a man to live a perfect life like you and I can't. He would willingly die on a cross, not because he deserved it, but to die for us and take the penalty of our sin, to be raised from the grave and to offer new life to anyone who would trust in him. That's the message of Christianity. That's the message of Jesus. And the point is not me and it's not you. The point is it's all about him. That we would take a step back and say, wow, God is really awesome. Now, here's what happens. How many of you guys have heard of C.S. Lewis? Okay, wrote like the Narnicle, the Narnia Chronicles. I'm going to start a new book. It's going to be great. Look for it. All right, so he wrote some awesome books, right? But for a long time, he was an agnostic. And when he would read the Bible, he would say, all I can hear when I read the Bible and all I can hear out of this language is like, God sounds like this little old lady, like begging for compliments. Like, hey, how's my hair? Like begging for affection and begging for attention. Like it's really all about God. Like, it's kind of selfish of God, isn't it? Like, to make it all about himself. You're like, come on, God, I thought you were like bigger than that. And the problem is our Western mind has a really hard problem with this idea. But what we don't realize is that God is the apex of this conversation. There's no greater place to put our affection. God is not begging for attention, begging for us to follow him. He is simply the utmost place to put our affection. So check this out. C.S. Lewis, as he wrestled with this, he became a Christian. He wrote reluctantly in his biography, right? He's like, God got him. He's like, dang it. He became a Christian and now I'm a follower of Jesus. And here's what he writes after reflecting on this conversation of like, God is this little old selfish lady. He says, okay, hold on. Let's back up. The world, it rings with praise, right? Think about it. Lovers, they praise each other. Readers, they praise their favorite authors. Walkers praise the countryside. We know all about that here in Boulder. Players praise their favorite team, the Broncos. And he didn't say that, but I'm just, editing a little bit. People praise the weather, and they praise good wine and good beer, and they praise their favorite actor, and they praise their favorite car, and their colleges and countries and children and flowers and mountains, right? Think about it. People praise stuff all the time. And here's what he says. I think we delight to praise what we enjoy. Because the praise not merely expresses, but it completes the enjoyment. Think about two lovers. It's not out of compliment that lovers keep on telling one another how beautiful they are. It's because the delight is incomplete until it is expressed. Is that good? You're like, whoa, that's deep, bro. So, what God is doing when he says, worship me, rejoice in me, delight in me, know me, follow me. He's not begging for compliments, but rather he's trying to give us the one thing we need, which is to not be about us. So a delight in God that leads to a rejoicing in God, it frees up the soul in magnificent ways. Listen, this is incredible. When God is the point and we are not, it sets us free from making life about us. Have you ever noticed how crushing it is when you make life about you? The weight that we carry when we show up and serve me, love me, it's about me, in the middle of conflict at work, in the middle of conflict at home, in the middle of conflict with extended family. Anytime we're at odds with someone and it's about me, the weight that we carry, the burden that we carry to be the center. But when we can put our affection on God and it's not about us, when it's His garden, it's not mine, when it's His garden and I just work in it, I'm free to love. I'm free to serve. I'm free to show up. I'm free to get on the ground with my kids and play. I'm free to come home and serve my wife. I'm free to serve my neighbors. I'm free to help 3 people move this week. That is supernatural, friends. I'm free to love my kids. I'm free to serve the church. I'm free to serve in and through the church in our city. Right, you see this? When it's not about me, it frees me up to not be about me. And it's a beautiful place to be. Now listen, the reason this is important is because James is operating out of this wisdom, right? That a proper knowledge of God is not that he's not imposing this obligatory affection on. He doesn't want us to follow him out of obligation, but rather to stir our affections toward him. That our souls find delight in knowing and following him. And that drives us to the conversation that we're about to have, that because God is good, and he's also for his glory, because he has this plan, because there's this life called a garden, and there is a way that it's going to function, and there are right things to plant, and things to pull, and things to avoid. Because of this, I can trust him. I can trust him that what he says to plant, what he says to pull, might actually be a good idea. All right, so James chapter 3, you ready? Woo! That was awesome. All right, here we go. James chapter 3, verse 13, in light, that's a lens I want us to wear for the rest of the time. Again, if wisdom is the application of knowledge, then the wisdom James is about to invite us into is the application of the knowledge of who God is as we just described him, okay? Now, in verse 13, he says, if you are wise and you understand God's ways, that's what we were just talking about, right? Prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom. You ever had someone walk around and be like, hey, I'm wise. Come get advice from me. Let's have a little, booth at the Boulder Creek Fest. All the wisdom you ever need right here, right? What do you think? That guy's not wise, right? Like, if you got to say it, you're probably not. And so he says, hey, if you're wise, prove it. The proof of wisdom, the proof that you actually have wisdom is in the way that you live in love. It's not the head knowledge that you accumulate. And so apparently there's some religious people with a lot of head knowledge that James is writing to, and they're claiming to be wise, but there's no fruit in their life. They're not actually loving. They're not actually serving. They're not actually living in a way consistent with the wisdom that they claim from God. Does this make sense? So he goes on in verse 14, he says, but if you are bitterly jealous and there's selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. Don't pretend like you're wise, right? If you're jealous of others and you're pursuing selfish ambition and the pursuit of knowledge to be wise is about trumping others, and you're comparing your planter box to someone else's and my tomatoes are bigger. We're just going to stop there. All right, let's keep going. So for jealousy, verse 15, jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, they're unspiritual, and they're demonic. There's some heavy words. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. So let's stop here for just a second and park on this. And so James describes 2 kinds of wisdom here that he's helping us embrace. And he says, hey, there's God's wisdom and then there's a false wisdom. And so part of this conversation is not just that there's this Webster dictionary definition of wisdom, but how do we know the difference, and what does it look like, and how do we make sure that we're planting the right things? And is it possible that God's wisdom and my wisdom can potentially disagree at times? Right? Well, if you're like me and you can look back and say, that was dumb, that was dumb, that was dumb. If you have a track record of that was dumb, then odds are, you can say, okay, if there's a God, if he's good, if he's for us, then let's just assume that his wisdom is a little better than ours, right? And I recognize not everybody in here believes in God, but we'll start there on that foundation. Now, as he has this conversation, he basically flips the entire conversation on its head of what we just talked about. Everything we just talked about, false wisdom rejects. God has a plan. There's a way that this thing's going to look, and there's a way for us to follow him. False wisdom is going to reject all of that. It's going to say, no, my thoughts are right. My way is right. This is my planter box. There's a right way that I want to plan it. I'm going to grow what I want to grow. You're not the boss of me. False wisdom is an individualized wisdom. I'm autonomous, and what's right for you might not be right for me. It's my garden. And if you're like me, we've all been there. Even if you're a follower of Jesus, you struggle. We've all been there because we like to make it about us. And he goes on and says that when this exists, when this jealousy and selfish ambition exist, it causes all kinds of problems, which makes sense, right? Like anytime you're selfish and anytime you're jealous, it causes all kinds of problems. And so he gives us some definitions to look at so that we can understand what false wisdom looks like. So again, if life is a garden and we're trying to be wise about what we plant, then we also need to know what we need to pull. So what do the weeds look like, right? I needed that when I pulled that garden the first time, right? It would have been helpful if someone told me, hey, these are flowers, don't pull them. So how do we know? Like, what do we need to pull? James gives us the answer. He says, he defines this false wisdom, the weeds, as earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So let me break these down for you. This is really, really helpful. Earthly, okay? False wisdom is earthly. Here's what that means. It means it only focuses on the here and now. There's no thought of eternity. I'm planting right now. I'm living for the moment. How many of you guys like Princess and the Frog? Right, I love that movie. It's awesome. If you haven't watched it, you need to watch it. But there's one song in there when they're singing and the prince guy's like, this life is all you got. Make the most of it. Sleep with a bunch of girls. That's basically what he says in Disney form. You can go screen it for yourself. Right, but he's like, anyway, that's totally what, he's got a lot of ladies on each side. Anyway, so the point is he's like, hey, live for now because it's all that matters. There's nothing after this. Plant whatever you want. Reap whatever you want because it doesn't matter. Nothing matters after this. He says that false wisdom, it's earthly. And so sometimes we look at this life and we say, no, God wants me to be happy. And James would push back on that and say, wait, hold on. Are you sure that that's the whole end game that God has for you? Are you sure that's the whole plan for this garden is for you to be completely happy? Is it not possible that your wisdom and God's doesn't align? Like my 3-year-old, right? I mean, he knows what he wants all the time. And if he could eat candy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he would. And he would think it's the best idea ever until it wasn't, right? And everyone in the room knows that's a bad idea for a 3-year-old to have that much candy all the time. He's going to be super sick. And so I'm able to come in as a parent and say, hey, I know you want that, and I know you think it's good for you, but it's actually not that great for you right now, right? And I'm able to help him navigate a decision that he can't see. Is it possible that you and I are like a 5-year-old sometimes? We think we want something, only to find out that it wasn't what we wanted. Or is it possible that you've gained something in life that you thought you wanted, only to find out that it didn't make you as happy as you thought it would? Is it possible that God's a good dad who loves us, who has a wisdom for us to embrace, and he's inviting us into this process of, hey, there's a bigger picture. What you plant now is not just about this life. It's not even about the next 10 years. There's an eternal aspect and a spiritual aspect to this entire conversation. So what should we be planting? It's unspiritual. That simply means it ignores God altogether. It ignores his purposes, it ignores his plans, it ignores his commands. There's a garden, but it's my garden. I'm going to plant what I want, how I want. And the last one is it's demonic. And that's a really strong word that freaks people out. But what it means is that if God is based on wisdom and truth, that the demonic is going to be based on lies. And so it's based on lies, that false wisdom believes something in contradiction to the truth of who God is, what he commands, and his ways. That if there is a garden and there is a way that he's created it to function, that we would believe a lie that actually God's plans are wrong or they're bad or they're construed and we disagree with God. Now, here's what happens. Have you ever just maybe said it in your mind or out loud like, I don't think God would blank? You ever been there? Where like something comes, you have something rubs you the wrong way, which is like every day that I read the Bible, right? And you're like, I don't think God would, and you fill in the blank. And James will say, wait, really? Like, on what grounds are we making that claim? Like, on your own wisdom? Or is there a bigger, like, what makes you think that God wouldn't? Like, is it possible that you and God could disagree? The answer for me is yes, and often. Okay, I don't know what it is for you. James is just building a ground and a foundation. Hey, there is a good wisdom and a less good wisdom. Let's try to find that good wisdom and pull the weeds that are not helpful. Now, in verse 16, he says, wherever there's jealousy and selfish ambition, there you're going to find disorder in every evil kind. Or think about it. Every time you're selfish, every time it's all about you and you're jealous and you're comparing and you're trying to one-up each other, right? It creates division and it makes life miserable. Every time you and I are the point, life starts to fall apart. I was at the Y the other day working out, dropped off my kids. There was this dad that went and got his kids and he had a son. He picked him up and he said, hey man, listen, I love you. And he kisses him. And he says, let me get it exactly. He says, be nice, be good, because everyone likes the good kid. And I was like, that is so smart. Like, that's some really good wisdom, Dad. And he puts his kid down and lets him go play. You know why he said that? Because there's some little jerks at the Y. That's why. Because everybody hates those kids. They're not my kids, by the way, right? My kids are great. No, right. Like, I saw him do that. I'm like, man, what did he do for that kid? He said, hey, buddy, you're not the point. You're not the point. Everyone likes the good kid. Don't make it about you. Have fun. You're not the point. I'm like, man, that's some good advice, Dad. True wisdom, what does it look like? Here we go. I got to hurry. Verse 17. It's a lot today. But the wisdom from above, hey, he's just going to define it for us. So he's like, all right, great. And I feel kind of bad about myself and a little bit insulted. Let's move on. Okay. Verse 17, he's going to tell us what God's wisdom looks like. It's the wisdom from above is, first of all, pure, and it's peace-loving and gentle and willing to yield to others. Just by the way, like if you just check it against yourself, this is like a checklist of what kind of fruit the wisdom of God produces in our lives. How you doing? It's full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism. It's always sincere. And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. So you say, okay, what happens if I follow God's wisdom? What's it going to turn up in my life? When I plant those seeds, what's it going to look like? And we'll just break it down, okay? It's first of all pure. It's pure. Wisdom from God is pure. What does that mean? It's a motive statement, right? You ever think about pure motives? Ever irritate you when someone clearly has another motive? Right? Or like you just don't trust someone when you can tell there's a motive coming through. What's beautiful is this is a representation of Jesus. Everything we see from God's wisdom was lived out in Jesus. And so here's what happens. When my relationship with God is restored, and I'm back in right relationship with God because of what Jesus did for me, my affection is on him. It's not about me. That starts to cultivate something in me, and it shows up on the outside of me. So when I love you, it's a pure motive. I love you because God loves you, and I love God. And it's actually just, there's no false motive. I'm not trying to manipulate you to behave a certain way or love me a certain way or give me certain things. I can just love you with pure motive. I can love you with genuine motives. I have nothing to hide. Does that make sense? True wisdom has nothing to hide. The second thing, it's peace-loving or it's peaceable. Here's what's really cool. Jesus comes in, and he makes us right with God. There was no peace between you and I and God. We're enemies of God is how Jesus would describe it. Jesus comes in, intersects that, takes the penalty for our rebellion against God, and restores peace, makes us right with God. We get adopted into the family of God. And then here's what happens. Because I have peace with God, now I can have peace with others. And here's what that means literally, okay? You say, what does this look like practically? It means that I'm slow to take an offense. If I'm peaceable, if I'm able to operate in true wisdom, I'm slow to take an offense. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I know it came across that you didn't mean that. I know you had that tone, but it was a hard day. And I'm able to actually diffuse things that I would normally react aggressively to. It also means that I am quick to forgive or to resolve an offense. I'm not going to let it fester. I'm not going to let it grow. I'm going to be continually pursuing peace with those around me. The wisdom from above, it's gentle. The translation that I looked at, it basically said it's not pushy. And I'm like, well, dang it. That's me. Like, that's like the opposite of who I am. And so think about this. Jesus, who is God, was gentle. He wasn't pushy. He had every right to be. He could have just thrown his weight around like, I'm God, get over it, right? Like, no. He somehow lived this life where he invited people to follow him, and he didn't shove it down their throats. That's the wisdom that every Christian is supposed to be able to embrace, that we're able to love people but it not be pushy. And here's the deal. It didn't resolve the truth. It didn't mean that Jesus wasn't the only way anymore, or that what Jesus was going to do was the only way to be restored back in a relationship with God. He just wasn't pushy about it. He invited people, and he was so whimsical about it that it kind of stirred affections to want that. And again, if it's not about me, I don't have to be pushy. It's willing to yield. Or rather, the ESV translates it open to reason. And this one's unique because our culture struggles with this conversation right now. Open to reason. Are you reasonable? This is a hot topic, right? Are you reasonable when we're having a conversation? You just blow off the handle. What it means is that I'm going to listen before I speak. Here's what's really cool. Listen. It means that I can be respectful. We can have a hard conversation. We can disagree. And we can still walk away friends. That doesn't happen very often in our culture, does it? But as Christians, God offers us the wisdom to be able to navigate in a way that we can love and serve people, be true to our convictions and our conscience, and not ruin the relationship in the process. It means I'm genuinely trying to hear you rather than just come up with my response in the moment to show you why I'm right. It's full of mercy. Mercy is this unique word. It means that I'm not only extending forgiveness for actions, but I also have this desire to minimize the consequences of those actions. So Jesus does that for us, right? Think about this. Jesus gives his life freely for us, not because we deserve it, not because we're awesome, but because he's awesome. He gives his life for us, and he meets us in that space, and then he doesn't say, all right, listen, here's what I need you to do. I need you to go sit in the corner and think about what you've done, right? I'm going to forgive you, but I need you to feel bad about it for about 3 months while we process through that. Right? What does he do? He minimizes the consequences. And then lastly, there's no favoritism, and it's always sincere. It's impartial, right? Listen, this is so cool. There's just one garden. It's not my garden, your garden, and we only let certain people around our gardens who we like, right? Everyone can grow here. Here's what's happening in the church community as we build City Church. It's a brand new church starting in Boulder. It's one garden. It's not even my garden. It's God's garden. Everyone is welcome here. Everyone can grow here. And you ready for this? We're going to be like a garden variety salad. Guys, it's going to be awesome. Yes. I worked hard on that. That was a really good joke. All right. So, right, no favoritism, right? No matter what your skin color, background, lifestyle, this is a place where you can belong and be loved and be safe. No favoritism. And it's sincere. Goes back to the beginning. All right, verse 18, here's where we wrap it up. And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace. There's the analogy of a garden, right? They're planting seeds of peace, and they're going to reap a harvest of righteousness. Let me end this way. When it comes to the conversation that we're having, Jesus brings us into right relationship with God. And so this word righteousness is kind of weird. We don't talk like that a lot. And so let me give you the definition of it so what James is saying is making sense. If we're going to operate in God's wisdom, it's going to produce this kind of fruit in our life, and the byproduct is a righteousness that starts to come up in and around our lives. It starts to affect others. But that word literally means to be right with God. Righteousness is just in right standing with God. You ever been not right with somebody, right, and then you got right? That's what we're talking about, is we're not right with God, but Jesus makes us right with God. It literally means positionally. I want you to think courtroom, guilty, and set free, and God punishes Jesus in our place so that we can go free. It makes us right with God positionally in that moment. Now, listen, I don't know where you are on your faith journey. I didn't grow up in church. I met Jesus when I was 15 years old, and I went from not right to right with God in a moment, not because of anything I did, but because I trusted what Jesus had done for me. In that moment, I went from separated from God into a relationship with God, from far from God to being a son of God. I don't know where you are on this journey, but I want to invite you into this understanding. It's Jesus alone that makes us right with God. But here's the deal. God loves us too much to leave us there. I did not become perfect, as many people in the room would attest today, because it still hasn't happened. When I met Jesus, I didn't become perfect that day. And I'm still not perfect today. And so what does this mean? I'm brought back into relationship with God, but then he wants to do something internally through me, transforming me from the inside out, that when I adopt his wisdom and I follow his ways and I acknowledge that he's made this life and it's a garden and there's a way to plant and a way to harvest and there's some things that I can do that are in line with how he's created things to work, when I start following that, Jesus is doing something in me that starts to show up through me. Does this make sense? Right? And so James is inviting us to live in a way that adopts God's wisdom. Now, here's what's really important. Is that the foundation of this is humility. It's simply saying, God's probably right and I'm not. God knows and I don't. Not in every area. It doesn't mean you haven't grown in wisdom, but it might be an area that we can grow in. So this entire picture is what it looks like to live a life of wisdom. So the question is this. Here's how we're going to end. How do you get it? Like, that's great. Like, I would love to have that wisdom. I would love to plant those kind of things and see that fruit in my life. But how do I get it? 2 Timothy 3:16. I'm going to end with this passage here. This is how we get it. All Scripture, the entire Bible, it's inspired by God. It's useful to teach us what's true, to show us what to plant, to make us realize what's wrong, to know what weeds to pull, to correct us when we're wrong, and to teach us to do what's right. Listen to this. God uses his word to prepare and equip his people to do every good work. And so maybe you're here and you say, man, I want God's wisdom. I want true wisdom. I want to operate in that vein. God says, great. I wrote a book. It's for you. It's like a gardening manual, right? Tells you all the good flowers. I would have known that day that it wasn't flowers, or that it wasn't weeds I was pulling, right? He says, it's a book to help you navigate this entire conversation. All that you need is right here. And so maybe you're here and you say, man, I want to know the God of the Bible. I want to grow in wisdom. Listen, after the service, we have Bibles in the back. We have devotionals in the back. We have tools for you to be able to dig into the Bible, to learn. It might be intimidating. We have lots of stuff to help you dig into it. Listen, if you want to pick it up this week, do a chapter a day out of the book of Proverbs. It's the wisdom book. It's going to do like one-liners like, don't hit your kids, it's bad for them, right? Like, and give them candy and it'll shut them up. Actually, it probably doesn't say that, but, right? And it's going to give you one-liners for wisdom. This, like, just start somewhere. Maybe there's some specific areas that you need God's wisdom when it comes to this conversation that we had. Maybe there's areas right now at work where you need to be able to plant the right things. Maybe in your marriage, you need to be able to plant the right things. Maybe with your kids, you need to be able to plant the right things. Maybe it's in your school relationships or even in your career right now where you need to be able to plant the right things. Maybe there's friend circles and there's, maybe if it's in your personal and emotional thought life where you need to plant some seeds internally to get to an emotionally healthy state and in a spiritually healthy state. Maybe it's in your finances to plant the right things to think long term. Maybe it's in your time management, right? This applies to every area of life. And so let me give you a couple of practical things. Dig into the Bible. Get connected in community because none of us are wise enough to interpret this thing on our own. We need each other to give us feedback, to grow together, and to add layers of love and accountability. Get into a city group. Plug into the church. Whatever you need to do to grow. Maybe you just need to volunteer and like help some college kids move in. Listen, one of the best ways to say it's not about me is to serve others, right? This is one of the most practical ways. Just say, shut up, body, we're going to go do this, and go do it, right? And make your hands do something you don't want them to do. So maybe you need to get plugged in and start serving. Listen, there are tons of adults, right, like in the back room serving kids, working their tails off right now so we can do this, and it's not about them. It's really cool of them. Really cool of them to value and invest in our kids so that they can know the same love of Jesus that we get to have access to. Maybe you're here and you need to give your life to Jesus. Listen, all of this starts, the whole access, the whole process is starting a relationship with Jesus by trusting him. And maybe you're here and you need to get baptized. All of that's on your connection card. There's going to be 60 seconds on the clock. And this is a moment for you to respond on your connection card. Our team's going to come up and they're going to lead us in 2 more songs. And this is an opportunity for us to simply respond. And guys, listen, I hope that we walk away today saying, wow, like God is really good. He's a really good dad who loves us, and he invites us into some really cool things. And so on your connection card, there's places you can sign up. Hey, I want to know more about city groups. I want to get plugged into community. I want to grow together. You can put on the prayer request on the back, things that you might need. Maybe you want to get baptized or you want to follow Jesus for the first time. Whatever it is, if you'll fill out that connection card, drop it in the basket after service. We'd love to be able to follow up with you and serve you in any way that we can. I'm going to pray for you right now. Will you bow your heads with me? God, I'm really grateful for our time together, and I'm grateful for everyone in the room. And I realize some of us in here, God, we're not followers of you. And at the same time, God, we all need wisdom that's helpful, wisdom that makes a difference, wisdom that recognizes not only this life, but what matters in the long term. So no matter where we walked in today, God, would you create a hunger for wisdom in us? And no matter where we are in our spiritual journey, God, would you stir our hearts this week to just ask you for some wisdom, to dig into your book for some wisdom. And maybe it's specific, maybe it's situational, or maybe it's generic. We just want to know you more. We want to know more about you. Because the more we know you, the more we can apply that wisdom. God, as we take this moment and close our time together, I want to pray for the victims of the shootings in El Paso and Ohio. I want to pray for our dear friends in the room where life is really, really hard. And God, we want to do so much more than send good vibes. We want to be a people that are motivated by love, that carry it with our words and our actions. So would you help us to see where we can plant what in a way that makes a difference? Would you help us to decrease evil in our world and see lives changed as we love and serve and give like you do? And God, any specific next steps that you have for any of us, would you put such a weight on our heart that we have to respond? Whether it's giving our lives to you for the first time and saying, we want to follow you. Maybe it's taking the step in baptism or getting plugged into a group. Whatever it is, God, would you put it in our hearts and make it heavy so that we could take that step and trust you and say, man, we know that you're good and we know that you're for us. And we think you have the best plan for our lives. It's in Jesus' name.